Hey, off? Is that too much?
I didn't even know that you had a TV playing.
No, I mean the light back here.
Maybe. I can hear you through the YouTube now.
Okay, I'm going to turn off that set and mute myself. You get to see my underwear. Hi, I think I'm live. We've been having some slight technical difficulties, and we're just looking for Frank's intro.
Yep, we are live. Okay, thank you guys for joining us for Into Valhalla, and we're on this week's episode. And we apologize for losing for Thursday, but life happens. We had to move it. We apologize, but we are here now, and we are good to get caught up. And I'm going to let Drew and Steven introduce themselves. But I'm from THL, and I'm going to move it over to Drew to introduce himself and the topic for today, as well as Steven.
Okay. I am Drew Warner. I am Gnome. I am from Hookah Enthusiasts, and previously a handful of other Hookah groups, but I am also a Viking at soul, and here to talk to you about the goddess Freya. And just on that same slight technical difficulty concept, I want to let Frank know that his video is not showing up. Steven?
All right, I see Frank now. So I'm Steven. I am also a part of several of the Hookah groups, and I am not a Viking at heart, but I've always found it very interesting. And as Drew said, we're going to be talking about Freya, or also Frigg, because they kind of are similar to the same thing. And we'll talk about that in a little bit.
From what I've seen so far, before we really get into it, she seems to have started off with a split personality for different regions, and that split personality developed into two different people over time.
That's pretty much what I got too, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that happened?
I think that it's because back then a lot of information was passed by word of mouth. And so when you have so many different storytellers traveling, you're going to get a bunch of bits and pieces of differences that are going to have similarities but also differences, and then eventually that's going to evolve. So Freya and Frigg both sound very similar, and from the dialects that they're going to have in the various regions, they could potentially mean the same thing. But what you end up with is a lot of stories making it one direction and a lot of stories making it the other, and the stories are a little bit different, and they kind of stick in their own various regions.
Absolutely end up regionally, culturally developing different personalities from the different stories, as you said. And then the strange thing is that the stories become reconciled in a way. They come back together and become more universal. And I think that is what solidifies the two split personalities into something of split conjoined twins now.
I would agree with that. And I think that this is one of the interesting topics that the differences kind of came back together into one being again a long time ago. I think that for some of the other characters and other stories that we hear, those kind of similarities and comparisons of these two people are probably the same actually happened later on when scientists were like researching and learning all of this stuff and going, hey, there's this person that has a really similar name and a really similar happening, and maybe that's actually the same. Whereas here, culturally, they did kind of recollide into one character again.
And instead of being a later scientific endeavor, I would say probably the early Christian monks collecting stories are the ones who found the amalgamations reconjoining, for lack of a better remelding. I don't know. That's a tough vernacular there. Anyhow, so I suppose the best place to start off with is, where did she come from? The primordial proto-Freya Frigg. And I'll jump off on that and say that we have to go back to the Azir and the Vanir, or Varnir, because Vanir sounds like something on a piece of furniture. But they're two totally separated families, two different bloodlines of the Nordic gods, and to get in depth about that would be a different podcast, I think.
Agreed.
They were on and off again peaceful, on and off again feuding for many different reasons, and Freya at this point was one of the Vanir, and she was totally embroiled. Her personality at this time was all about Sadir magic. She was the top shaman, if you want to use some modern culturally appropriated terms, and she went in a almost peace treaty sort of way to live with the Azir. And this actually caused a few problems and caused some of the warring to flare up again, on and off. Because the Azir originally referred to her as Hydir, or bright. I'm not sure if that was a reflection of physical beauty or of intelligence. But they were just blown away by her ability to use magic, blown away by her values of honor, kin, and loyalty and obedience, and how she handled law. And they started to see themselves as greedy and selfish, and this reflection is part of what caused another head-on collision between the groups. She did become the wife of Odin. Now, if we're going to talk about the linguistic or split-off tradition of Frigg, and I've actually seen Frigg with an A on it sometimes.
There's also Freya and Freyja with a J.
Exactly.
So
and these all sound like split-offs of the same character, doesn't it?
And they all have the same personalities and same traits and same capabilities. It's almost like they're the same.
Yep, so we could simply say it's a multiple personality disorder in relation to cultures and pockets they exist in.
Right. Well, and one of the things that I found particularly funny was that one of the main differences that scholars have created to differentiate between Freya and Frigg is by asserting that Freya was more promiscuous than Frigg. And essentially you have these two different characteristics of people that are otherwise basically the same. But all of the tales pretty much suggest that they're the same. Scholars later on, in compiling all of this information, basically tried to make some sort of distinction with that.
Logic through it, yeah.
Right.
And even the name and all these variations we're talking about, the direct translation of Freya is the first, the best, the original, the brightest, the most, where the masculine form, Frey, another deity, is titled, meant the foremost, the not forerunner, but greatest. Because, again, you got these odd ideas of individuals like Odin being called Allfather, who are kind of in the middle of the family tree, because they're taking the position of Allfather, not that they were that.
Right, and I think that one of the things that you're kind of touching on is like if you take a look at the various different names, so Freyja, like Freyja, translates to lady, and it's very similar to it is a cognate of the modern German word Frau, which is Mrs., right?
Mhm.
Whereas Frigg translates more with the ancient root meaning beloved or beloved. So she was beloved by all. She, and that ties in with the light and the other names that you've given or translations of the name that you've given. But each different culture, like the word means something just a little bit different. And I think that that's more a representation of what she meant to each of those cultures separately. They were all very similar positions in their beliefs, but not exactly the same.
Yep. And
go ahead.
Somewhere in, I suppose, it's hard to really gauge timelines of as these things develop, but I suppose somewhere near the middle, there's a Nordic poem, and I'm going to completely butcher this name, the Lokasenna. The name of the poem is Lokasenna, I guess. It's hard to say. Where Freya warns Loki when he's making fun of Frigg.
Interesting.
So there, at this point, there are clearly two characters that are living together. So it was another recombining. And Freya says, now, Loki, you can't make fun of her because Frigg knows the fate of all beings from her ability to perform Sidir magic. And her weaving activities that give her this information through weaving and divination is mirroring the Norns.
Very, very closely similar, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, so the Norns, they also are a triple feminine that is a split personality, single-minded, three people. So it's like, at some point, they, as you were saying, culturally, perhaps even the Norns were Freya, Frigg, Frisia, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting if you try to pull apart all of these different characters into separate characters. I think a lot because all of these stories were passed along by word of mouth, so the stories are probably constantly going to be interwoven as they're told by different people, and as they tell the story over and over, and as they drank a lot before telling the story. And so you're going to end up with a lot of different parallels, I think, of characters that are similar, but maybe not exactly the same.
Not only that, even the story of Beowulf, they mention her in poems because of her ability to come up with the future and the fate of those around her, and not only that, she's able to foresee, like you said, the fate of people that were involved with her, and she always performed rituals with liquor called Vovita. And the poem That was what the ritual was called when she used to use a special liquor cup inside these rituals. And inside Beowulf, the poem is called Velveeta. And they talk of her in Beowulf and how she was able to help Beowulf see some of his future and predict some of the events that were to happen. So you see her present even in stories like Beowulf and see how she has influenced history with her powers.
And I believe it might have been the same poem that I just mentioned too. It may be another one. I read a handful, but another similarity is Freya and Frigg are existing at the same time again, and Freya owns a cloak that's made of falcon feathers that lets her transmogrify into a falcon and be able to travel and fly.
And she can give the feathers from that cloak to others and give them the same ability.
Right.
Which Freya also can do.
Right. Frigg and Freya both have sets of these feathers. Sometimes it's as a cloak, sometimes it's on their own, sometimes it's even portrayed like as a fan. So it's like she's
I think that I think that one of the really kind of interesting notes that I've found is on a lot of the characters we've talked about so far, there's fun stories and there's all these very specific things that you'll hear different tellings, but the story is basically the same. And with Freya / Frigg, there are a few things that she's really known for, like her magical powers, her ability to spin and understand the future and see what's going to happen and the fates. But otherwise, like pretty much it's more of an argument of who is who instead of, you know, all of the stories about her. You know, one of the things that is established is she's seen as, you know, because her husband is Odin and he is always traveling around the 9 realms and on adventures and seeking knowledge. She's regularly pictured as crying what is listed in several places red gold tears because she's sad. And one of the things that like I found was particularly interesting, like I was talking about a little bit earlier, you know, she was being accused of infidelity. She was seen as promiscuous, and various forms were rated as more or less promiscuous. And my thoughts were like kind of good on her because, I mean, let's be honest, Odin got around.
Yeah,
Odin would like change forms to get around. So, I mean, it's really interesting that the few things that she kind of has is she has a few magical powers, but mostly she's kind of known as just kind of being in her space. She wasn't regularly worshipped by the Viking people for anything in particular.
She wasn't the feminine character of the home. She wasn't an archetype of something that was, I don't want to say useful, but something tangible to every person. Like Thor.
Relevant to everyday life.
Right, unless you were a practitioner of their magic. And that, again, that's extenuating circumstance.
Right.
Also, she was, you were talking about the golden red tears. I mean, that sounds so strange. I think golden was probably a term for shining and valuable, and red, of course, a life force, blood, because she was not only this very beautiful, you know, pretty, imbued with stunning looks, but she was also a goddess of death. She also was able to, besides the Valkyrie and a handful of other deities, choose from the fallen who she wanted to keep for herself in an odd way.
Right. I mean, if I remember correctly, she actually more often than not, like, got first dibs on the fallen. Like, everyone thinks of, you know, falling in battle and going to Valhalla and staying with Odin and fighting alongside Odin in preparation for Ragnarok, but she kind of got to get first dibs of her favorite people in the beginning.
Her sorting, and nowhere did I really find what she decided to do with these people.
Right, just that, you know, she got dibs.
Yeah.
So
we've kind of gone off on a good tangent, but we missed a little bit of the family relations. That
sure, yeah,
she is the daughter of Njord, and because the J is silent, I'm just gonna say
Njord.
Njord,
Sure.
Which, man, that sounds a lot like the Norns.
Right.
And the other sister being Nethris. And that makes three sisters. So that's another point where I was like, man, that's some overlapping storytelling and possibly split personality issue, if you will, between these characters. Could they have been the same and possibly donned a different title for the different role they were performing? Even in the same mythological group. And
yeah, I think that's one of the other things that you consistently hear stories about. A lot of the other gods in Norse mythology kind of putting on different hats and being different characters, and some of them are really well known. You know, I mean, Odin was constantly known as the Wanderer, and he was pictured as like the wide-brimmed hat cloak, even though that was really only a specific detail in a few stories. It's entirely possible that maybe because she didn't have anything tangible to people, they had all these different stories that could potentially be seen as, you know, just her different hats or different characters that she was.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that ideal, through researching Freya specifically, opened up my imagination to maybe there's a smaller number of Norse gods who are just performing different identity-changing tasks.
Yeah, I also wonder if, you know, maybe they just kind of go dormant and then come back, because there's an image that was found in, I don't know if we'd be able to put it up because I know that Frank is rocking it on the phone today, of kind of a map that is very non-accurate of like kind of the family tree.
Yeah,
and it's super hard to follow. Somebody is licked into existence by a cosmic cow. Someone is birthed by 9 different mothers. Like, this is not an easy thing to follow, but it would make sense that these stories kind of die away and aren't really heard of for a while, and then they're brought back by, you know, maybe some smaller culture, or there's a battle that's happened and some sort of you know, one clan kind of taking over another, and then it suddenly comes back with maybe a different name.
Yep, and as you were saying, the example of being birthed by 9 different mothers, could that be an individual with 9 different roles?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no real knowing, but
just as Freya and Frigg had been married to Odur, O-D-R.
ODR, which is an obscure way and virtually the identical to Odin, O-D-I-N-N, which is from the Old Norse form Odin.
And
so,
way down the line, when they're seen as 2, Odur and Freya only have 2 children. H-N-O-S, Hanas, and Gersimi. But if you're thinking that they're parallels of the originals, they had a lot more children than that.
Right.
So it would make sense that now, at this later time period, they decided to have 2 more. You know? But yeah, as you were saying before, the party girl aspect of Freya and the fact that it's some revelrous. I'm gonna just say party again to be redundant. At some big party, she nearly slept with every character there, including gods and elves, etc.
And a slave. There was a slave in there somewhere.
And this was all supposed to have been forgotten in a drunken daze, but good old Loki's the one who was like, "Hey, look what she did." So, how does the family tree evolve when not only her husband is doing things like this, but so is she?
Right. I think that she's kind of an interesting character, and it's hard to kind of stretch out and tell, like I said, like interesting stories, because it's more of a opening perspective on what information we do have and what we can get to. Because, you know, I mean, everyone knows Friday is Frey's Day, and I mean that's cool in itself, but you know, and there's a lot to be said for who she is, but mainly like it just comes down to the confusion of who she was really, and it seems like people are more worried about like a lot of the poets and writers are kind of more worried about comparing them and giving different details that are all very similar than, you know, maybe telling more of her stories.
Absolutely. Now, here's the big controversial point. Could we possibly say, as an archetype, that that archetype is one of the first real pushes of strong feminism?
Oh, I definitely think so. I mean,
she gets the first pick of the dead. She has wild parties and does whatever she wants. She's married to the top dog, and yet she still chooses his slain warriors.
Well, right. She chooses his slain warriors, and I think that one of the big points that kind of needs to be noted is when you read about Odin traveling around, everyone's just like, oh yeah, Odin's going to travel around. He's going to hook up with this person. He's going to, you know, produce an animal or whatever with this person or with this animal or whatever. And that's just kind of like, all right, that's fine. He's going to do what he wants to do. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's really interesting that she's kind of imagined as sitting and crying these red and gold tears over his absence. And I mean, like, I get like being sad if your partner and your best friend in life is going to be gone or whatever, but instead of like being mad, like it doesn't say that she's upset because he's going and like doing all of these things without her, because she has her own life and she's going to behave in a very similar way that he is. And it's just kind of showing that, like, you know, they're on the same level in a relationship. So I think in the whole terms of like female empowerment, sure. And I can't speak a lot to that because, I mean, that's not a thing that I experience regularly. But through the stories that are being told, the one main thing that Freya, Frigg, and you know, all of the different characters they have is the archetype is she is this strong ruling woman. She is in charge of you know, the entire kingdom when Odin's gone, and she handles business. She takes care of what she needs to take care of, and she's the one that has the power to essentially mold and shape the future by knowing the fates. And I think that's a really cool concept.
Absolutely. And again, with paralleling her to her husband's activities, he goes out and he hunts for power and knowledge in a very visceral way. She does it her own way through divination and her amazingly competent, skilled, etc., as they say, mastery of the Sadir magic. And I think that is why a lot of times there's this stigma, maybe, that Sadir magic is practiced by women. Even though there were Sadir men out there, they were usually seen as effeminate.
Well, and Odin was one. Odin constantly was hunting down that knowledge and that capability, and he was known for being able to empower using runes and using magic, and he was never seen as feminine because it was almost a brutal way that he always got it, whereas all of the stories kind of tell that she inherently had these capabilities. There wasn't a hunt for this knowledge. There wasn't, sacrifice for this power the way that Odin like plucked out an eye or hung himself for 9 days from a tree in order to try and gain these like capabilities. Like, it's a very kind of brutal, violent way to get this power that he went through.
Or chugged so many vats of the special mead, etc.
Yeah, the mead made from humans, people.
Yeah.
Person, yeah.
The Soylent Green mead.
Yeah, right. So it is a very interesting parallel that, and one of the things that kind of, I guess, maybe annoyed me a little bit was when, in a lot of the things that I was hearing, like, I read about what scholars are thinking now and how they've interpreted all these stories and whatever, and it's almost kind of annoying that these scholars are trying to differentiate who the characters are by how promiscuous the person is, when she's not any more promiscuous than her male counterpart. And it's like that very obviously shouldn't be an issue at all.
That focus on promiscuity came from the historians, not from the culture it originated out of. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, and then again, I think a stereotype, a common collective that we all think of, probably originated with her because her patron animal was kitty cats.
Right.
We still think of cats as feminine.
I mean, most people do.
Well, in a lot of cultures, and it's really hard to get away from that, and it's really hard to trace that back to anything besides the fact that, cats, they were brutal, fucking vicious hunters.
I feel like "were" is not the correct term. I have 2 cats, and I have so many dead animals in my house because they have a cat door.
That's true, and yeah, just a few weeks ago, because it's become spring again, I found my cat out in the bushes in the front yard crunching on something. I looked around, looked down, and was like, oh, hey, there's a headless rabbit, and he's eating the head.
Yeah.
I'm like, there's nothing frail or negatively feminine,
right,
about this.
And I almost think that, like, if you continue along with that parallel, because cats were her bag essentially, if you look at the hunting styles, Odin had his dogs, right? His hounds, and his hunting style was very much hounds. It was vicious, it was loud, it was constantly roaming and forceful, whereas cats are more cunning and smart and agile. And it sounds
stealth,
right? And it sounds like Freya accomplished the things she wanted to accomplish. Not that we get a lot of stories about it.
Right. The force of finding his power versus Freya with the stealth of already knowing what she's doing.
Right. So I think that this is a really interesting. I was originally kind of hesitant about choosing this because I was like, I don't know if we're gonna have a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite interesting that it's more about understanding kind of the representation of character that you get from all the different gods and what she represents. The other thing, and this is a story that we kind of told before, but like Balder. Right? So Balder was her Frey's son, and he was beloved by everyone. He was handsome and gracious and cheerful, and if I remember correctly, he was the one that was killed with the arrow of mistletoe, right?
Fell shot, yeah.
So, basically, this was her child, and it was beloved by all, and in like the motherly, caring way, she wanted to protect him. So she made a deal with like everything in the world that could potentially hurt him, going like, you don't hurt him. And so he could never die. And Loki, being Loki, caused a lot of problems by finding out that mistletoe was the only thing she didn't make a deal about, because she was like, that's so weak it would never be able to harm anyone.
Right.
And so he had a blind guy throw a spear, shoot an arrow, some sort of projectile.
Cultural differences again.
Right. Made out of mistletoe that then killed her son. And she pleaded to try and have him return from the underworld, only to have it shut down again by Loki, because she had to get every single creature in the universe to weep for her child. And it turns out that Loki pretended to be a giant and wouldn't cry, so Balder was then stuck with hell forever.
Which, again, I think needs to be reiterated that this is not Tartarus. This is not Christian hell.
This is hell isn't the character or the goddess who is in charge of the underworld.
And it's not necessarily punishment, but it's imprisonment.
Correct.
Yeah.
It is just another realm.
Wow. Frank, how much time we got left?
He doesn't know. He's just sitting smoking.
We have 14 minutes left.
Okay.
Yeah, it's harder for me to do it from here. to do like the pictures.
Sorry. That's okay. Yeah, I think because we broke her character down into an archetype with all of her Siamese twinses, I'm not sure what is left to cover, but just the fact that, so many people who look into, like, and I'm not meaning to be negative on them, but neo-paganism, they get such a scraping off of the top of this information and never get into comparatives.
Right.
So, yeah.
I mean, I feel like this is definitely a different episode than the ones that we've done before. Because most of the time, by the time we're done, like, we've only kind of grazed the surface on all of the information available on these various different characters, and we get a pretty good understanding. But I do think it's particularly interesting, and as much as we all like to, kind of emphasize that women could be viewed as just as strong as men and had very equal capabilities in society, it is kind of striking to me that there's such a difference in available information.
Yeah. And I don't think that when her mythos were recorded that was necessarily a focus. I don't think they were interested in portraying that narrative of, there is equality. Because I don't think there was a lack of it ever in that specific culture.
But the people who recorded the culture were
through their filter.
Right.
Yeah.
So this was not generally recorded by any sort of Nordic societies. This was more of after you had, anti-paganistic religions that were coming in. I don't want to specifically say Christianity, but there are a lot of male-dominated religions
Style.
and communities that were the ones that recorded all of this information. And so it's pretty obvious that if all of the men were in power at the time, they're not going to want to represent a bunch of women who had power. So I do really wonder with situations like this, how much of the full story we really get.
Mhm.
And as much as it's not technically historically accurate in any way, the show Vikings, I think, does a pretty good job of kind of portraying the capabilities of women, and trying to tell the story with the limited information available of goddesses like Freya slash Frigg slash Freyja slash
Pretty good.
whatever else.
Yeah. I mean, just change a couple vowels and she could have as many names.
Right.
And a lot of times they say that that the two were made because one's supposed to more tightly in her passion with her promiscuous nature versus her former name, which is more associated with promiscuity. But they always say that happened shortly before Christianity came about, the split of the names. But nobody really knows why.
Right.
Something I didn't look into, but I now feel remiss that I didn't, because we have a little bit more time here, is I would like to peek into, and maybe some episode will do covering tidbits that we haven't covered before, and I'd like to throw this in there, her relations to these Slavic goddesses that were so similar to the Nordic, and what she might relate to in that culture.
I think that would be a pretty cool topic.
Yeah. So, yeah, we're definitely going to have to plan a bonus material or leftovers episode.
I like leftovers.
Leftovers, yeah.
Yeah. We'll just mix a little like ground rock in it, and it'll be just like the old Viking ways.
Yeah. Wow.
It's funny that in Christianity they began to label her almost as a witch.
Oh, well, she was the highest adept of using magic, so once magic became both a no-no to everyone and, only for the clergy to use. Yeah.
Well, and there's a very interesting representation of powerful women in a lot of British history, where any woman that was old and knowledgeable was immediately viewed as a witch.
Yep.
Yeah,
it's unfortunate.
And I mean, part of that is, I wonder how much of that comes from the parallels that they're going to have with any woman that has power, especially over a long period of time, is going to be very similar to Freya. And part of it is Christianity trying to shut down, Old Norse mythology, or like the paganistic ideas. Some of it is, oppression of women. That was a real thing. There's a lot of different reasons, but like generally the image of the crone, like the old lady, was always seen as pretty much a witch.
And is our modern stereotype in, fluffy Halloween portrayals. And there you go again. What's her familiar? Oh, it's a cat.
Right.
Yeah, not only that, they, when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, it was on a Friday. And they say that it was due to Freya luring Eve into eating the forbidden fruit. The Great Flood also happened on a Friday. A lot of the plants in Scandinavia used to have Freya's name, and then they changed it to Mary. When the Christians declared her a witch, they said that her cats once served her for 7 years. After 7 years, they would turn into witches, disguised as black cats. And
so like McGonagall.
She came down to a group of witches which numbered 12. And because this is where witches covens come from, and then One of them gave her a cat, which made the 13th witch, and that's why Friday the 13th is considered an evil day,
And
because they were branding
probably the
Freya.
exact reason they decided to exterminate the Templars on a Friday 13th. Besides the other explanation of Judas being the 13th member of the supper, but
Yeah, they
So
really don't like
the Christians
number
were
13.
really afraid of Freya. They or maybe they're afraid of paganism or the Norse gods. But it's funny when you hear these stories, because you realize how dominant the Norse gods were, and how involved they were in life back then, to the point where the Christians felt like they had to disparage the culture because it was overshadowing Christianity. And, well, to me anyways, I felt like that's why they did it.
and in so many mythologies around the globe, those archetypal parallels existed. So when, like when we're talking about Thor, his I'm not gonna remember the name. Tunir, Thor's clone in the Slavic was just so much identical. And when you move around to Celtic and Germanic and down, and even in some Armenian, you've got these very, very close parallels. So perhaps those Christians you're talking about who were afraid of Norse were like, well, it's everywhere, just in a different guise.
Well, there's like a little bit of a difference in, the names and necessarily like the family trees. But like, even if you look at like Greco-Roman mythology, you're going to have a lot of parallels of different gods that go across. And so one of the easiest ways to adapt a religion is to go, hey, ours isn't that different from yours. You should come check ours out. And I think that like, specifically in the times of European expansion from the British colonies, like they pushed very hard to get other people into Christianity, and so they adapted a lot of different cultural cues from other cultures and other religions to try and make people more comfortable in joining them.
Yep. Sort of a bait and switch. Look, we're copacetic. Well, now that you're in, it's not copacetic anymore.
Right. It's copacetic, and not really, though.
It's funny how Friday used to be a lucky day. You used to want to have your children on Friday. You used to want to plant your vegetables and your harvest on a Friday. You used to want to get married on a Friday. You realize how political things were when it came to religion back then. It was more of a political fight between two different ideologies rather than more of a religious one. So, like, when you read about these stories like Noah's Ark and the flooding on the 13th, and Eve eating the forbidden fruit on a Friday, all this stuff, you read these stories different. I read these stories differently now, and I look differently on Christianity due to just knowing about their battle, their sort of ideological battle to try to overcome and become the more dominant religion over paganism. They were trying really hard.
And if you keep going on that, you're going to get me off on a tangent that goes way away from Nordic. So, yeah, it's wild. But the archetype of Good Friday, Freya, is so well rooted in that almost Jungian psychology style that she's not going to go away. Even when somebody tries to make up a new belief system from the ground up,
still there.
They're going to utilize a character like that. Yeah, absolutely. You're always going to have the antagonist Loki character. You're always going to have the protagonist Thor character. You're going to have a
The knowledgeable mother.
Knowledgeable mother. You're going to have the kingship lord character, etc. And yeah, I feel like they probably, all those archetypes probably existed in the pre-Nordic and before, but when you get to Norse, man, that's when it gets fleshed out.
Yeah.
I don't know. Ever since learning about Christianity and the Norse gods and learning more about Norse mythology, I can't tell you enough, like how I walk into a church now, a Catholic church, and I look at it through different eyes, and instead of looking at it as a place of religious worship, I look at it as a place full of a political past that had this enthralled battle with paganism.
Just wait until you start to do an offshoot and learn about meanings of architecture, and you're going to look at those buildings and go,
yeah.
because the stone tells a whole other story too.
I can't wait for us to cover that on an episode, because I think it'll be interesting to talk about.
So I guess, do you guys have any ideas of what we should do next week or in 2 weeks? Next episode? We haven't done Loki yet.
Yeah, I'm sure that'll definitely bring in some interest and some views because of his current pop culture fame as well. So
yeah, I mean, none of us look as good as the one actor. I don't remember what his name is, but we try.
Let's do Loki next.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So and ladies and gentlemen, before next week, I will say this because most of you will be shocked. Loki is a fire giant descendant, not ice.
Not ice. That is true.
Sorry, Marvel.
Where do you think they even came up with that? You would think if they just checked a little bit deeper, they would bring the correct.
They did their own thing all over the board.
They at least finally got Thor's hammer right in the most recent in Infinity War.
Oh, revamping it as Stormbringer. Yeah.
Yeah, whatever they called it, but it's at least relatively correct.
Yeah. Oh well.
Anyway, well, until next time.
Yep. All right.
Thank you guys for joining us. We'll see you next time. We'll be covering Loki.
Good night.